Vale Tirog stood beneath a hard white sky, while black towers rose from snowfields like broken spears across the horizon. The kingdom looked strong from far away, yet fear already lived quietly behind its sealed and iron gates. Prince Kaelan was the youngest son of the dead warrior king, and everyone at court already knew his name. He was slim, very pale and dark-haired, with thoughtful gray eyes and hands better suited for books than axes. In a kingdom that praised conquest, that gentle nature made him seem weak before everyone constantly watching. His father had united the Frost clans by force, then fallen during a northern campaign 3 winters earlier. Since then, the throne had been ruled in all but name by Kaelan's elder brothers at court. Crown Prince Maelor first entered the great hall like winter given human shape, broad-shouldered and heavily gold-armored. He carried himself with cold certainty, and soldiers straightened whenever his long shadow crossed the floor. Prince Sarek arrived beside him with a tall, lean frame, a narrow face, and clever blue eyes. Sarek smiled often, but that smile never warmed anyone because it always hid some cruel thought. Those two were praised as heirs of their father, while Kaelan was mocked as the soft leftover son. Servants bowed shallowly to him, warriors laughed behind him, and nobles used him for easy court jokes. Kaelan endured it because he still loved his family, and because he feared what the kingdom was becoming. He noticed things others ignored, since nobody bothered hiding ugly truths from the brother they dismissed. Villages along the southern ridges were emptying after sudden blizzards swallowed roads without warning or any pattern. Men returning from the northern marches no longer bragged in drinking halls after their campaigns quietly ended. They sat staring at walls instead, hollow-eyed and shaking, as if something beneath the ice had watched. At night, hooded envoys entered the palace through the old eastern gate, where torchlight showed no reflections. Kaelan saw one pass a bronze shield, and the polished surface held only the torch flames. That missing image chilled him more deeply than any winter wind sweeping through the battlements at night. He tried warning Maelor once during supper, speaking carefully because he still hoped for reason there. Maelor set down his cup and answered, "You mistake caution for courage, brother, and fear for wisdom." Sarek leaned back and added, "If you want respect, bring results, not frightened stories to court." Kaelan fell silent then, but his worry only hardened because neither brother looked surprised by his report. Days later, a storm darker than soot rolled over the capital, though no clouds moved beyond. Kaelan used the confusion to follow 2 cloaked figures through lower corridors beneath the keep unseen. He stayed far enough back to remain unheard, then watched them enter his father's sealed vault. That vault had been locked since the king's funeral, and opening it without witness broke ancient custom. Kaelan waited until the figures left, then slipped through the stone door before hidden gears closed. The chamber smelled of iron, dust, and frozen incense from rituals used by earlier kings. His father's war helm rested untouched, but the floor showed fresh scrape marks leading toward the rear wall. There he found a missing slab and a tunnel descending into darkness older than the castle. He followed the tunnel to a buried chamber lined with black ice that did not melt. Strange runes covered the walls, and chains lay broken across a circle carved into the floor. Within that shattered circle, Kaelan saw fresh sweat mixed with frost and realized some prison had opened. He understood then why the envoys had no reflections and why northern soldiers returned empty. Before he could retreat, Maelor stepped from the shadows with Sarek beside him and sealed the exit. Neither brother looked angry at first, which frightened Kaelan more than any shouted threat would have. Kaelan raised his lamp and asked, "What have you opened, and what did Father hide down here?" Sarek folded his hands and answered, "Father hid power, and he lacked courage to use it properly." Maelor moved closer and said, "The realm is starving, our borders crack, and strength demands a price." Kaelan stared at the broken circle and understood they had already paid something dreadful to something worse. He wanted to run straight to the nobles, but he knew nobody would trust him there. He also knew shouting there would only get him seized before proof reached anyone outside court. Because of that, he chose to keep them talking first, hoping one confession might save the kingdom. Kaelan steadied his breath and said, "You are feeding our people to whatever waited here below." Maelor's face hardened then, and Sarek's smile finally vanished like a carefully removed mask before him. Sarek stepped forward and replied, "You always see rot, little brother, because weakness teaches suspicion before duty." Then Maelor raised a hand, and armored guards entered from a hidden side door behind Kaelan. His brothers announced that he had broken the royal vault seeking forbidden power for himself alone. The accusation was absurd, but the guards obeyed instantly because Maelor's voice already carried the throne. Kaelin struggled only once before stopping, since resistance there would prove the story they planned. He forced himself still because he needed a chance later, and a living prisoner still had choices. Bound in iron, he was dragged through midnight snow toward the ancient glacier called the King's Grave. The glacier rose beyond the capital like a frozen mountain split by one endless black scar. Every child in Vale Tirog heard stories that the scar was the underworld's mouth below the world. Torches burned blue in the wind as Maelor, Sarek, and the guards reached the cliff edge. Kaelin looked at his brothers one last time, still searching for any sign they might stop. He found none, only iron purpose in one face and bright cruelty in the other. Sarek touched Kaelin's chin and said, "Treason deserves a deep grave, and silence keeps kingdoms stable." Kaelin answered, "You are not saving Vale Tirog. You are selling it piece by piece." Maelor gave the order without hesitation, and the guards hurled Kaelin into the abyss below. He fell through freezing darkness as jagged ice walls flashed past like shattered mirrors around him. Wind tore the breath from him, and blackness swallowed torchlight long before the fall finally ended. Then the ice gave way beneath him, and he crashed into buried snow inside a cavern. Pain burst through his body, but the drift softened enough impact to keep him conscious below. He lay still for a long time, listening to distant cracks echo beneath the glacier like moving chains. At last he pushed himself up and found a cavern vast enough to swallow the palace whole. Pale blue fire glowed from crystals in the walls, revealing pillars of ice and ruined stone arches. In the center rested something so large that Kaelin first mistook it for a fallen ridge. Then it moved, and a great scaled head lifted from the shadows with a low, rumbling breath. The creature was Veyr, a colossal dragon with silver-black scales, shattered horns, and clouded blind eyes. Rusted chains still hung from his forelegs and neck, half buried under frost older than memory. Kaelin should have fled, but there was nowhere to go, and the dragon already knew it. Veyr turned his blind face toward him and said, "You smell of royal sweat and fresh betrayal." Kaelin could barely stand, yet he answered honestly because lies felt useless before such a being. He said his brothers had thrown him down after opening a prison their father had sealed. Veyr listened in silence, then lowered his head until cold breath washed across Kaelin's face there. The dragon said he could not see weak shoulders or trembling hands, only heartbeats and truth. Those words struck Kaelin harder than the fall, because nobody had ever measured him that way. Veyr then revealed the history hidden from the court above and twisted by generations of pride. Long ago, the royal bloodline had sworn to guard the ice barrier imprisoning demons beneath Vale Tirog. The kingdom's first kings did not conquer the north to claim glory, but to watch the prison. Dragon Force and royal sweat had forged that barrier together, and Veyr had been its last living warden. When men grew greedy, they chained him below and turned the oath into a legend. Kaelin asked about his brothers, and Veyr answered with a weary anger older than kingdoms. Maelor and Sarek had bargained with demon envoys for storms, fear, and borrowed war strength. In return, they fed the barrier stolen souls from villages and marches, twisting its purpose completely. That cruel trade kept cracks closed for a time, but every payment poisoned the prison further. Now the barrier was failing, and the demons no longer waited patiently beneath the ice. Kaelin felt despair rise in him, because his brothers had crossed farther into darkness than he imagined. Still, he asked what he could do, since despair alone would abandon everyone still alive above. Veyr answered that only a true royal oath joined with dragon force could preserve the barrier. The dragon explained that his essence carried ancient frost force meant to bind, halt, and return hostile power. It would remake Kaelin painfully, because mortal flesh was never meant to bear such force directly. Kaelin hesitated then, not from fear of pain, but from fear of losing himself completely. He understood that taking such power might twist him into another cold weapon like his brothers. Yet refusing meant freezing alone underground, while the kingdom above was sold beyond saving entirely. Because he loved his people more than his pride, he chose the painful road and stepped forward. Veyr split one scaled claw across his own chained limb, letting silver-blue essence gather in his palm. The dragon lowered that shining measure, and Kaelin drank before courage could fail him there. Agony hit instantly, racing through his veins like ice mixed with lightning and shattered glass. He collapsed onto the cavern floor while frost spread across his skin in branching marks. The crystals overhead dimmed, then blazed brighter as power answered power inside his body below. Kaelin cried out until his voice broke, and Veyr endured the sound without turning away. Hours passed before the pain loosened enough for Kaelan to rise on shaking knees again. When he lifted a hand, the air crackled with pale shards that hovered and spun. Veyr tested him by breathing a small burst of ancient force, threaded with warding power. The spell-like blaze froze midair inches from Kaelan's face, locked inside glittering crystal there. Instinct moved faster than thought, and Kaelan thrust his hand forward in panic and focus. The frozen force shattered outward as jagged lightning, blasting across the cavern and splitting a stone arch. Veyr gave a harsh laugh, then named what Kaelan now carried and what it could do. Dragon force had bound to royal sweat, allowing him to freeze hostile spells in motion. Once held, those attacks could be hurled back as shattered lightning stronger than their original force. But Veyr's voice darkened when he warned that another bond had formed during the ritual. Deep beneath the cavern ice rested the old weapon buried with the prison's first ceiling. It was the black sword Mournglass, forged to drink demon essence and sever corrupted oath lines. The blade answered royal sweat touched by dragon force, and now it had noticed Kaelan. Veyr led him through buried halls to a lower chamber where darkness seemed thicker than stone. There a black sword stood in frozen rock, its edge reflecting light like a crack in night. Mournglass looked simple at first glance, yet the air around it pulled at Kaelan's chest. He understood the danger immediately, because the blade did not call to courage or honor. It called to hunger, promising easy strength if he fed it enough broken souls and pain. Kaelan stepped back, but the frost marks on his arms burned in answer to the sword. Veyr explained that the weapon was needed against the demons and the oathbreakers waiting above. He also warned that Mournglass devoured the wielder's humanity if drawn without discipline, memory, and purpose. Kaelan did not reach for it then, because grabbing power blindly was exactly how his brothers fell. Instead he knelt before the blade and swore he would only take it to protect. The sword's pull eased slightly, which told him the promise had been heard, though not accepted. Days passed in the abyss while Kaelan learned to move with his remade body and fierce power. Veyr trained him among ice pillars, sending old ward bolts and frozen curses toward him without warning. Again and again, Kaelan froze each attack in midair and sent it back as shattered lightning. He failed often at first, and each failure coated his limbs in numbing pain or drove him sprawling. Yet he kept rising because every stumble taught him control, and every hour above worsened the kingdom's fate. Between training, Veyr taught him the old royal oath and the hidden map beneath Vale Tirog. He learned that secret vents connected the abyss to the glacier face near Old Watch shrines. He also learned that demon standards rose only when bargains neared completion and open rule followed. On the seventh day, the cavern shook with a distant horn sounding through the ice above. Veyr lifted his blind head and said the final phase had begun sooner than expected. Kaelan knew delay was no longer wisdom, even though Mournglass still terrified him deeply within. Before leaving, he returned to the lower chamber and wrapped both hands around the black hilt. The blade came free with a sound like frozen chains snapping far below the world. Cold flooded his mind, and shadows offered quick victories against every face that ever mocked him. Kaelan nearly gave in, because pain and humiliation had built a fierce anger inside him. Then he remembered empty villages, hollow-eyed soldiers, and the brothers he still hoped to save. He mastered that surge by naming his purpose aloud, and the sword's hunger quieted enough. Veyr could not leave the abyss fully while the old chains still anchored his wounded body below. Even so, the dragon guided Kaelan to a rising tunnel and pressed his forehead gently forward. Veyr told him the bond would let them feel each other across distance, so neither stood alone. Kaelan climbed through narrow shafts of ice for hours, until gray daylight finally broke above. He emerged on the glacier ridge beneath a storm-racked sky and looked down at his kingdom. Vale Tirog's walls still stood, but black banners now flew beside the royal standards everywhere. Twisted symbols moved across those dark flags like living frost, and ranks below marched unnaturally straight. Demonic standards rose beside his brother's banners over the capital towers, plain and undeniable at last. Kaelan gripped Mournglass, felt dragon force pulse through his veins, and understood his true battle. Reclaiming the throne was no longer about pride, nor revenge for the abyss, nor proving doubters wrong. It was about stopping the family he still loved from finishing the sale of their people's souls. Kaelan moved down the glacier with Mournglass wrapped tight, because open roads would expose him before he learned enemy strength. Veyr followed through their bond like a second heartbeat, guiding him toward old watch paths buried under drifting snow. The blind dragon could not walk beside him yet, but his steady presence kept panic from swallowing thought. By nightfall, Kalen reached the ruined northern frontier, where burned towers leaned over trenches filled with blue ice. He found abandoned camps first, and that told him exactly how badly Maelor had tightened his grip. No food remained in the wagons, yet ledgers still sat neatly stacked beneath frozen canvas there nearby. Kalen checked one book and saw tax marks beside villages already listed as emptied 2 months earlier. He understood the pattern at once, because Maelor always hid cruelty inside clean systems and perfect records. Through the bond, Veyr felt his anger flare and asked, "What do the dead numbers tell you?" Kalen steadied himself and answered, "My brother taxes graves now, because fear obeys faster when hunger does counting." He kept moving northward first, because charging straight toward the capital would waste his one hidden advantage. He needed proof, allies, and time to understand how far both brothers had already poisoned Vale Tirog. 2 days later, Kalen reached an abandoned monastery crouched beside a frozen cliff like a cracked stone hand. Monks had once guarded frontier shrines there, but black soot now stained every arch and stair. In the inner court, he found circles of black fire burning soundlessly across the snow without heat. He almost stepped closer, but Veyr pushed sharp warning through the bond before curiosity carried him too near. The dragon explained those circles marked demon pacts, where human promises were rewritten into chains no eye could see. Kalen looked around and noticed prayer walls carved over with fresh tax notices and military orders there. The sight told him monks were forced out first, because truth and memory always threatened rulers built on lies. As he searched the sleeping cells, he heard armored boots enter the hall below and then stop. Kalen did not rush toward conflict, because unknown numbers inside tight stone would end his mission immediately there. He climbed into roof beams first and listened, using the new senses Veyr had sharpened through weeks underground. A war mage entered below, and his arrival changed the room like poison entering clear water. The war mage wore layered dark robes over chain, with silver nails and eyes rimmed violet by stolen power. 2 tax riders came beside him carrying scroll cases, and their breath shook though neither spoke aloud. Veyr told Kalen to listen deeper, not to words first, but to breathe and silence together. Then Kalen finally understood what the dragon meant about hidden truths carried by small sounds alone. The riders sounded afraid before the war mage even turned, which meant obedience here came from terror. The war mage unrolled a map and said, "The prince remains dead, so collect the northern grain without delay." One tax rider swallowed hard and asked, "What of the missing children from the ridge hamlets?" The war mage smiled thinly and answered, "Sarek has uses for bloodlines touched by old warding." Kalen felt ice creep under his skin, and Mournglass pulled hard against its wrappings at once. He wanted to strike immediately, because saving those children mattered more than preserving any careful plan. But he forced himself still first, because one reckless clash would save nobody beyond that monastery floor. He needed the map, the names, and proof linking Sarek directly to royal sweat hunts everywhere. When the tax riders moved into the side chamber, Kalen dropped behind the war mage and struck. The war mage spun fast and fired violet flame, but Kalen froze it in air with one hand. He hurled the trapped force back as shattered lightning, and the spell user collapsed against a prayer pillar. Mournglass stayed sheathed then, because the enemy was human, and Kalen still feared what the blade might take. He overwhelmed the tax riders quickly after that, tied them with altar cords and copied every name. One village mark stood out immediately, because it lay beside a symbol matching the black fire rings. Veyr sensed his thought and said, "That place is a funnel, where captives become tribute for larger works." Kalen left the monastery before dawn and crossed 3 valleys, following the marked route through broken mines. Along the way, his bond with Veyr deepened from guidance into something warmer and harder to name. When snow blinded him, the dragon helped him feel open ground through shifting air and distant echoes. When despair rose, Veyr answered without contempt, and that mattered more than any spell or weapon. Kalen had lived his whole life under measured judgment, mocking smiles and cold lessons about useful strength. From Veyr, he learned silence could hold patience, and correction could arrive without humiliation or scorn. The dragon taught him to hear deceit in forced calm, fear in clipped speech, and grief beneath anger. Those lessons changed how he met people, because he now listened beyond words before making any choice. The marked village was gone when he reached it, replaced by carts, chains, and a temporary tax stockade. Families stood in snow lines while collectors weighed grain, blankets, and tools with brutal care there. Above them, demon banners hung beside royal standards, making the insult plain even to frightened children. Kaelan watched from a roof beam and saw Maelor's order in every measured cruelty below him. Nothing looked wild there. Forms were stamped. Tallies were checked. Bread was seized according to posted law. That order chilled him worse than chaos, because Maelor had made evil feel official and ordinary. At the center stood a collector in lacquered armor, flanked by a second war mage marked by Sarek's sigils. The war mage demanded another hidden child from each household, claiming crown service under emergency decree. Kaelan heard sobbing behind one door and understood the families were already hiding survivors inside floor pits. He could not leave then, because waiting for perfect timing would hand those children over by sunset. He drew Mournglass only when the war mage raised his hand toward the nearest house and smiled. The sword felt colder than river stone, and the entire square seemed to flinch around it. Kaelan burst from the roof and cut through the war mage's next spell, splitting violet force into harmless frost. The collector shouted for guards, but the villagers scattered at once, breaking every neat line in seconds. Kaelan moved fast, driving soldiers back with frozen bolts and flat strikes from Mournglass' dark edge. Then a horned demon climbed from one black fire pit, and the air filled with ash. Kaelan had no choice then, because ordinary steel could not stop what rose from that circle. He met the creature head-on, and Mournglass cut through its smoky armor with a hungry shiver. The horned demon collapsed into black sparks, and the blade drank them before they touched snow. At once, Kaelan saw a flash not his own, a fortress under red sky, chains, and endless screaming orders. He staggered because the memory came with terror, and for one sick moment he felt panic. Veyr caught him through the bond and forced his breathing steady before the second wave could swallow him. Kaelan won the clash and drove the remaining soldiers into retreat, but victory tasted wrong afterward. The villagers stared at him with gratitude first, then fear when shadow clung too long around Mournglass. He wrapped the sword immediately, because he could already feel how much easier drawing it had become. That frightened him more than the demon had, since comfort with hunger was how corruption quietly entered. He freed the captives, burned the tax ledgers, and sent families toward hidden glacier shrines Veyr remembered. Then he spent 2 nights inside mine tunnels, shaking through dreams stolen from the horned demon Mournglass consumed. In those dark hours, Veyr became more than guide or weapon master hidden beneath the ice. The dragon listened while Kaelan admitted he feared the blade might hollow him from the inside. Veyr answered, fear is still a guardrail, and losing that fear is when the true fall begins. That warning helped, but it did not stop the next victories from coming easier than the first. News spread anyway. In mining cities across the north, people whispered that a pale prince struck tax trains. Others whispered a grave-born monster carried a black sword and fed on shadows after battle. Both stories helped him and harmed him because rebellion needs legends, yet frightened people cling to simple lies. Kaelan entered the first mining city through drainage channels beneath iron foundries and sulfur smoke. The city had changed since his childhood visit, when workers sang through shifts and market lights filled dusk. Now every square held levee boards, ration cages, and warning posts left empty to frighten onlookers. He saw Maelor's crest everywhere, but Sarek's violet circles burned brighter over the governor towers. In the workers' quarter, Kaelan sabotaged tax stores, shattered prison locks, and sent stolen grain into hidden basements. Each hit was fast, because drawn battles would only trap civilians between him and the garrison. More people joined him quietly after that, not as named followers, but as hands passing food and messages. He remained alone in sight, yet rebellion began to breathe around him through many unseen choices. Meanwhile, the capital turned his return into its own twisted theater of power and reason. Maelor stood before the high court in gold armor, stern and perfectly controlled beneath torchlight and banners. He told nobles the kingdom survived only because he accepted ugly bargains weaker men feared touching. He admitted harsh taxes, forced levies, and emergency laws, but called them the price of keeping borders standing. Some nobles looked uneasy, yet many nodded because Maelor sounded like duty made flesh before them. Then Sarek stepped into the same chamber, and his open delight exposed everything Maelor tried to veil. The younger brother wore dark silks threaded with runes, and purple light crawled over his fingers like pets. He mocked old laws, praised forbidden power, and promised a stronger throne after all resistance was broken. Where Maelor sought obedience through order, Sarek sought awe through fear and spectacle alone. Their danger was different, but together they formed a complete trap for the kingdom above. Kaelin learned more when he reached the capital outskirts and used old servant tunnels beneath the outer walls. Veyr guided him through forgotten routes from the age when dragons still guarded kings directly there. The dragon could not see the halls, so Kaelin became his eyes and described every turn softly. In return, Veyr mapped guard rhythms by vibration and breath, proving their bond had become something neither expected. Kaelin trusted him more than anyone living, and Veyr trusted a human again for the first time. That trust carried them into the palace crypts beneath the throne, where truth waited colder than ice. The chamber below the crypts had been carved recently, though it sat under stones older than dynasty. Kaelin found ritual pits, black chains, and a half-built throne inside a ring of silver ash. At the rear stood Maelor's father Helm, surrounded by demon script and royal seals. He realized then what his brothers had truly been promised in exchange for everything they surrendered. They did not seek strength alone. They meant to restore their father as an obedient immortal king. Veyr felt his shock and asked what he saw, so Kaelin explained every symbol through clenched teeth. The dragon answered grimly they wanted love returned without will, because memory wounded them more than loss. Kaelin understood the cruelty then. Both brothers had grown up believing their father loved his compassion more than ambition. Instead of grieving that wound honestly, they had chosen to rebuild him as a praising weapon. In the same chamber, Kaelin found sealed records bearing Maelor's sign and Sarek's private cipher underneath. The documents explained the Abyss plan with cold precision, and each line struck harder than any blade. His brothers had never meant to defeat him cleanly when they cast him into the glacier. They specifically needed royal sweat thrown into the old prison to awaken Mournglass through suffering and dissent. Kaelin nearly collapsed reading that truth, because even their betrayal had been part of a larger design. He had not merely been discarded. He had been used as a key. For several breaths he could not move, and Mournglass pulsed at his side like dark approval. Part of him wanted to give in then, because pain that deep can make cruelty feel simple. But he knew surrendering to hate would finish the work his brothers had begun beneath the throne. He took the records instead and turned toward the upper passage, planning to expose everything publicly if possible. Sarek blocked the stair before he reached it, smiling as purple sparks crawled along shattered stone around him. The prince looked delighted, not surprised, which meant he had expected Kaelin to reach this chamber eventually. Sarek spread his hands and said, "I knew the Abyss would wake the blade in you." Kaelin gripped Mournglass and answered, "You fed me to darkness because you needed a tool." Sarek laughed softly and replied, "Father admired your heart, so I chose to sharpen it." Kaelin understood talking further would only give Sarek more room to gather strength across the chamber. He attacked first, because escape with proof mattered more than answering cruelty with wounded pride there. Sarek fired stolen sorcery in lashing arcs, and Kaelin froze each strike before hurling them back. The clash exploded upward through the cathedral district as both brothers crashed from crypt stairs into moonlit aisles. Statues shattered. Bells cracked. Lightning burst through stained glass and turned snow into sheets of white steam. People fled in terror as Sarek drove him across rooftops with demon-backed force and warped fire. Kaelin held back at first because cathedral guards were still human and trapped between command and terror. That restraint cost him ground, and Sarek used it mercilessly, overwhelming whole streets with burning sigils. Then Sarek struck a tower and sent stones falling toward a line of fleeing worshippers below. Kaelin made his choice instantly, because saving them mattered more than guarding his own soul longer. He surrendered fully to Mournglass and felt its hunger flood his arms, chest, and thoughts with icy clarity. Time seemed to narrow. Fear vanished. Every hostile motion became simple to read and easier to answer. He cut through Sarek's storm, crossed the distance, and struck with one terrible perfect blow. Sarek cried out as the blade shattered one arm's stolen sorcery and tore through flesh without ending him. The villain collapsed back across broken steps, ruined and driven into retreat beneath his own failing lightning. But the unleashed surge did not stop there. Cathedral guards nearby were caught in the shadow flood surrounding Mournglass. They were still human, still frightened, and still alive when the blade drank through them by accident. Kaelin saw their final flashes all at once: duty, hunger, regret, children, and blind terror before silence. He dropped to one knee, horrified, while witnesses stared at him not as prince, but nightmare. Someone shouted, "Monster." Then the cry spread faster than truth ever could across the district. Kaelin tried to speak, but no words could undo what they had just seen. Bells rang the alarm. Crossbows lifted. Even people he wanted to save now fled from his shadow. He took the records and ran, because staying there would only turn shock into overwhelm and seal guilt. Veer felt everything through the bond and guided him toward the glacier with urgent, steady force. For 3 days, Kalen fled through storm and ruin while patrols hunted him as demon, traitor, and cursed prince. At last, he reached a fissure beneath the glacier, where buried stairs descended into a temple of ice-black stone. Veer waited there in a vast chamber under the glacier, chains still hanging from his scarred neck and legs. Kalen stumbled forward, covered in frost and shame, and dropped Mournglass onto the temple floor. He told the dragon exactly what happened, because hiding even one part would make the next choice worthless. Veer listened in heavy silence, and grief moved through his huge frame like distant thunder under rock. Finally, the dragon lowered his blind head and revealed the last truth he had kept hidden. Long ago, dragons forged Mournglass to consume demon kings when no prison or ward could hold them. The blade could devour corrupted souls completely, but human hands were never made to bear that hunger safely. Every mortal who wielded it long enough eventually fed it his own heart, not all at once. Instead, that loss came piece by piece. Veer had hidden that truth because Kalen might have refused the sword too early, and the kingdom needed him armed. Yet the dragon also confessed something gentler and harder he had come to believe in the man. He no longer trusted merely the sweat. Kalen looked at Mournglass lying between them and finally understood the shape of his path ahead. He might have only one true chance to use the blade before it erased everything Veer chose to trust. The temple fell silent after that, except for ice cracking somewhere far below like a clock beginning again. The crack sounded again, and Kalen lifted his head because the whole temple floor had started trembling beneath him violently. Veer raised his chained foreleg and said, "The long night has begun, and the barrier is failing now." Kalen looked toward the dark stair and understood delay had ended, because every moment now favored Sarek completely. He picked up his black sword, Mournglass, carefully, then wrapped it again because fear still kept his judgment alive. Veer lowered his blind face close and said, "You cannot walk back there alone, even if you try." Kalen frowned and answered, "Your chains still hold you here, and I will not waste strength breaking them." Veer shifted against the floor, and old iron snapped under his weight because the shaking had weakened anchors everywhere. The dragon's silver-black scales flashed through temple light as he pulled free another chain with a harsh grinding sound. Kalen stared in surprise, and hope struck him hard because the kingdom might still see its true guardian return. Veer forced himself upright, though pale frost spilled from old wounds, and his clouded eyes faced upward anyway. He said, "I cannot fly long and I cannot survive waste, so we strike once and finish it." Kalen understood the warning immediately, because Veer was already giving more than his wounded body could safely bear. He nodded and answered, "Then we go home not as conquerors, but as the last shield left." They climbed through a rising fault beneath the glacier, while the earth groaned around them like cracking armor plates. When they emerged, the frozen moon hung red above Vale Tirog, and black light leaked from city walls. Kalen saw the capital below, and every tower now carried banners mixing royal crests with demon script. Veer crouched on the ridge, enormous and terrible, with rusted chain links still hanging from neck and forelegs. Then the dragon leaped into the storm, carrying Kalen down toward the capital through ash-colored snow and red moonlight. Citizens on the outer roads dropped to their knees or ran screaming, because legends were descending from the glacier. Kalen did not blame them, because he knew how monstrous he must appear beside a dragon and cursed blade. Still, he raised one empty hand and shouted that the prince had returned to break the pact. Word spread ahead of them anyway, faster than soldiers could close lines, and crowds gathered behind shuttered windows. Veer landed outside the northern gate, where possessed knights already waited in blackened plate with violet eyes. Kalen had hoped to spare as many guards as possible, but he recognized the abyss moving inside them. He chose battle there because turning away would abandon the trapped city and surrender the gate entirely. Veer surged forward first and scattered the front ranks, while Kalen froze incoming curses into hanging crystal walls. Then he hurled those stolen spells back as shattered lightning, driving the possessed line into collapse across the snow. The gate chains burst under Veer's claws, and the northern gate swung open as citizens watched from roofs. Some people cried out in fear, because the prince they mocked had returned changed into something half-holy. Others opened hidden doors and dragged children clear, because hope had finally become stronger than terror inside them. Kalen moved street by street toward the throne citadel, disabling war circles and breaking possession seals quickly. He did not linger in any clash, because the city itself was the true battlefield and time mattered more. Veyr stayed beside him whenever streets widened, smashing siege idols and blowing frost through demon braziers. Bells rang from tower to tower as freed citizens pointed out hidden troop routes and barricaded alleys ahead. The rebellion that once whispered now moved openly, and people threw down tax ledgers into the snow. At the market square, Maelor arrived alone beneath the red moon, and his gold armor looked dimmed by ash. Crown Prince Maelor's square face was drawn with exhaustion, and one gauntlet was cracked from recent strain. Kaelan stepped forward with Mournglass lowered, because he still wanted one chance to stop this without more ruin. Maelor looked at him without guards or titles and said, "Sarek has gone beyond the bargain, and I was blind." Kaelan did not trust the words at once, because Maelor had built too much evil behind calm order. He answered, "You threw me into the abyss, and our people paid for your need to feel strong." Maelor closed his eyes briefly, and his voice finally lost that hard certainty everyone once feared in him. He said, "Father praised your mercy, and every praise made me feel small beside you." Kaelan stared because the answer was uglier and sadder than ambition alone, and it explained too much. Maelor continued, "I chose strength that nobody could question, because love felt softer, and softer felt like failure." Kaelan finally understood his brother's core wound, though understanding did not erase the suffering he had caused. He replied, "You wanted certainty so badly that you fed fear until the kingdom forgot what strength was." Maelor nodded once and looked toward the citadel, where black fire now poured from the upper windows. He said, "I tried to stop the coronation when I saw what Sarek became, but I was late." Kaelan tightened his grip, because Sarek had already crossed into something worse than kingship or treason. They ran together through the palace road, because the citadel was breaking apart and the long night accelerated. Inside the throne court, demon envoys stood before the altar with no reflections in polished bronze columns. Sarek waited above them wearing torn black robes over fresh armor plates, and one ruined arm glowed violet. Sarek's fox-like face had become sharper and fever-bright, and his smile looked starved rather than amused. He raised Maelor's father helm from the altar and laughed, because the gate beneath the throne was opening. One envoy reached toward him, and Sarek understood immediately that the demons meant to own his coronation. He had always hated serving anyone, even while pretending loyalty for power, so he made his choice instantly. He turned on the envoys and overwhelmed them with stolen force, not from courage, but from pure refusal. Their shadows rushed into the blackened steel, and Maelor's father helm clamped around Sarek's head with screaming light. Armor from the dead king's ritual frame wrapped around his body piece by piece, locking onto flesh and sorcery together. Kaelan saw the truth at once, and shouted that Sarek was making himself the vessel for the abyss. Sarek answered through echoing voices and said, "Better that than kneel before carrion hidden under the world." The floor split behind the throne, and a vast crack opened into boiling darkness beneath the citadel. Maelor stepped between that opening and Kaelan, because he had finally understood what his choices had unleashed. He turned back once and said, "I cannot undo this, but I can hold it long enough." Kaelan saw his hands shaking, yet the older brother planted himself anyway and raised both arms toward the gate. Before acting, Maelor understood retreat would spare his life briefly, but doom Kaelan's only chance to save everyone. He stayed because failing his brother one final time would make every earlier betrayal complete and useless. He slammed his gauntlets into the broken seals, and golden ward lines burst around the widening abyss like chains. The gate slowed, but the effort burned through him instantly, and sweat ran from beneath his armor seals. Kaelan ran past him toward Sarek, because wasting Maelor's sacrifice would turn repentance into nothing. Veyr crashed through the upper wall at that exact moment, filling the throne chamber with frost and falling stone. Citizens in the lower court saw the dragon coil around the broken hall, and the whole capital froze. Sarek rose above the shattered throne on wings of black fire and hurled infernal spears across the chamber. Kaelan froze those spears in midair and launched them back as storms of shattered lightning toward the altar. The clash blasted columns apart and shook the citadel foundations, while Veyr pinned loose masonry from crushing fleeing servants. Sarek attacked again and again, using demon force, royal power, and the dead king's armor as one engine. Kaelan answered every strike with harder control, but Mournglass kept drinking the abyss leaking from each broken spell. The sword was growing colder in his hand, and he felt pieces of himself thinning around the edges. Below them, the gate widened despite Maelor's wards, and roaring darkness started pulling everything toward the throne crack. Veyr understood the danger first and drove his wounded body down across the opening, using sheer weight and frost. Kaelan shouted for him to pull back, because the dragon's scarred body was already breaking under strain. Veyr answered, if the gate opens fully, nothing above survives long enough for your next choice. He held there because he knew Kaelan needed one clear shot, and that chance would not come twice. Maelor dropped to one knee near the seals, and his gold armor finally began splitting apart from pressure. Kaelan saw him failing and almost turned back, but he understood why that would ruin everything now. Helping Maelor directly would satisfy love, yet it would also hand Sarek the seconds needed to complete the gate. Maelor looked up and forced out his final words, saying, "Do not save me. Save what I failed." Then the older brother collapsed across the seal line, and his body became the final weight holding one chain closed. Kaelan cried out once, and that grief cut deeper than hatred ever had because Maelor had chosen truth too late. Sarek lunged through the storm with abyss fire wrapped around the dead king's armor, roaring that mercy was weakness. Kaelan almost answered with rage, because pain, betrayal, and loss had stacked inside him for years. Then he felt Mournglass waiting for that hatred, hungry to take it and finish him through easy power. He understood in one terrible instant that the sword would devour what remained of him if fed anger. So he made the harder choice and held on to something the blade did not expect from a ruined prince. He thought of Veyr believing in him beneath the glacier, Maelor's broken confession, and every child hidden from collectors. He poured love, grief, and refusal into Mournglass instead of hate, and the blade changed in his hands. Frost raced along its dark edge, but the shadow hunger stopped widening because it had been denied poison. Veyr felt that choice through their bond and used his last strength to anchor Kaelan's soul in place. Kaelan leaped above the broken throne and met Sarek over the abyss, where lightning and infernal fire tore through red moonlight. Sarek slashed down with the dead king's armored fist, and Kaelan caught that strike on Mournglass' black edge. Instead of cutting flesh alone, the sword reached through the armor and severed the demon claim buried inside Sarek. Every stolen power burst outward at once, and the dead king's armor split apart into useless blackened pieces. Sarek's face returned for one final moment, empty and furious, because power had never filled the wound beneath it. He reached toward Kaelan and rasped that strength was all their father ever truly respected. Kaelan answered no. You only chose that lie because love scared you more than judgment. Mournglass finished the cut, and Sarek collapsed into the gate's pull, stripped of every bargain he had seized. The abyss roared once, then reversed as the sword dragged the remaining demon force into itself completely. Veyr pushed harder against the crack so the collapse would fold inward instead of tearing the capital apart. The gate sealed with a thunderclap that broke every window in the throne district and buried the altar. Mournglass shattered in Kaelan's hand after taking the last abyss into itself, and black fragments rained across the ruined throne. The release nearly tore Kaelan away with it, because so much of his soul had been pulled outward. Veyr sent one final surge through their bond and held him anchored to the living world. Kaelan crashed beside the ruined throne and barely stayed conscious, while the red moon slowly faded toward white. Veyr's huge body locked in place around the sealed crack, and pale crystal spread across his scales. Kaelan dragged himself forward and touched the dragon's face just as the last living warmth left it. Veyr did not speak again, but the bond carried one final feeling: trust, peace, and pride. Then the crystal finished climbing over him, and the dragon remained entwined around the broken throne forever. Dawn came gray and cold over a silent capital that had expected never to see morning again. Citizens entered the citadel carefully and found Kaelan alive among ruin, with Maelor fallen beside sealed wards. They also saw Veyr's crystal body surrounding the throne like a guardian who had chosen his post. Nobody mocked the youngest prince then, because every wall, every survivor, and every sunrise now stood because of him. Still, Kaelan did not feel triumphant, because victory had cost his brothers, his sword, and the one soul who truly knew him. Days later, the nobles placed the crown before him in the repaired Great Hall, and he almost refused. He wanted to walk away from power completely, because his family had twisted that hunger into generations of harm. But he remembered Veyr's faith and the people outside, who needed a guardian more than another proud ruler. So Kaelan accepted the crown reluctantly, and swore the kingdom would never again exist for conquest first. He outlawed the demon cults, ended the tribute systems, and opened the ledgers of every false emergency. He tore down victory monuments that praised domination and raised new stones naming villages once erased from records. The crystal form of Vaer remained in the throne citadel, and people came there not to worship fear. They came to remember that guardianship had built Vael Tirog before conquest poisoned its memory and purpose. Kalan ruled with visible scars and frost marks still branching across his arms beneath royal sleeves. Some citizens still feared him, and he did not demand forgiveness, because memory should not be forced. He carried Maelor's confession privately, grieved Sarek's empty fall, and never excused what either brother had done. Yet he rebuilt roads instead of war camps, granaries instead of levy prisons, and shrines instead of conquest towers. In time, children no longer repeated old jokes about the soft prince unfit for battle and rule. They learned instead that the kingdom had been saved by the brother who refused power's oldest lie. Strength alone had made monsters of his family, but mercy with courage had kept the human heart alive. And in ruined stone beneath a once cursed throne, crystal wings still caught the morning light.